If you guys haven't already figured out from that intro, this video is a bit of a different one for us. This is a pre-built OMEN 30L gaming PC, and it's pretty unique in a few ways. First of all, OMEN is going all in on AMD with the 30L series by offering a variety of Ryzen CPUs and higher-end Radeon and GeForce graphics cards. So now buyers who simply want a plug-and-play system can take advantage of all the goodness that Ryzen has to offer. I have to thank both OMEN and AMD since they're sponsoring this video, and they basically told us to go nuts on this PC. They told us to do whatever we want with it. So we're basically going to take this whole thing apart, examine the components piece by piece, and then find out if there are any areas for improvement. This is going to be exciting. Now, OMEN claims that they've designed the 30L with an eye towards super easy upgrades by avoiding the custom components large system builders sometimes use. But how close is that to the truth? I'll make sure to leave all the timestamps in the description down below, but let's just say that the 30L is essentially a blend of lessons that OMEN has learned from the DIY market, but they've also added a few more things that I'd love to see in my next build too. For those of you who are interested, the 30L has a ton of configuration options. They go from a Ryzen 5 3600 and an RX 5700 XT all the way up to a Ryzen 9 3900 RTX 2080 Ti gaming beast of a GPU with 32 gigabytes of memory and tons of storage. Ours is a middle-of-the-road setup with a Ryzen 9 3900, an RTX 2080 Super, 16 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz memory, a 256 gig SSD, and a 1 terabyte hard drive. Yep, that's a seriously rare gem of a CPU you can't buy at retail, but more on that a little bit later. The 30L uses a stealth matte black theme that's pulled off really well on the inside and outside. And yes, that 30L name means it's 30 liters in size. There are some clear points taken from the DIY case market here, with a good 2 inches of ventilation on either side of the front panel for airflow to the front 120mm fan and a controllable RGB illumination. Personally, I also like the IO's positioning at the top since its recessed notch leads to easier access and less height restrictions. One of the things I wanted to bring up right away is you'll see a lot of additions to the system that are engineered to protect the components and their connections in case the FedEx dude decides to kick the package around a bit. You know, that happens. But anyways, let's see what's under the hood, and to do all of that, you'll need to hit this button right over here and the side panel pops open. Pretty simple. Here, there's a locking mechanism running the opening's entire length that uses metal latches to hold everything securely in place. It's really well executed, and I wish more cases had this. Not only that, but an easy access setup like this will give novices more confidence to get in there and upgrade components or even troubleshoot them. The first thing I noticed here is how well integrated the RGB lighting strip is. It's tucked away into the case's upper area, and there's a reflector to make sure there's even light spill within the interior space. Speaking of access, cable management is pretty well done. The fan headers are at the top edge, and the clear CMOS jumper is clearly visible as well. And while the NVMe SSD's position means only 2 memory modules can be installed, getting to it doesn't require removing anything else or shifting cables around. There are 2 plastic 3.5-inch hard drive caddies along the 30L's front, and they have completely toolless installation. In our case, a 1 terabyte 7200 RPM Seagate drive was pre-installed, but OMEN also pre-wired the second spot just in case if you want to easily add more storage. Nice touch. Installation of a hard drive is pretty straightforward too. Just slide out the caddy, pop out the vibration dampening mounts onto the drive, lock it in place, and slide them back in. There's space on the caddies for 2.5-inch drives too, but OMEN doesn't provide the necessary mounting screws. I guess now is a good time to discuss airflow. Even though there's plenty of ventilation, the lower front 120mm fan is the only one that can be installed since the rest of this area lacks any cutouts or mounting points. That's too bad, and I'd also like to see a dust filter here. That second fan is actually sourced from Cooler Master. While we can't find it anywhere in their current lineup, this looks like a high airflow OEM version of their Master Fan Balance series with an additional LED halo ring attached to it. It mostly pushes air towards the GPU's intake area and then onwards to the power supply, which has a side-mounted fan to take advantage of the natural right to left airflow in this section. A bit of that fresh air is also being funneled upwards towards the CPU area and then exhausted with a rear 80mm fan. And about that tiny exhaust fan, well, OMEN wanted to keep the chassis as narrow as possible, so adding a larger one here wasn't possible. OMEN also provides a top-mounted 120mm fan bracket if you want to install one, but while the holes are there, the airflow certainly isn't. There's just a blank metal plate there, so I wouldn't advise doing that. Alright, with that out of the way, let's start taking this thing apart, starting with the RTX 2080 Super. It's held in place with a plastic brace that's supposed to protect it during shipping, but it also acts as a convenient anti-sag bracket. The card itself is pretty unique too. This is a reference card engineered specifically for system integrators, so instead of having a downdraft cooler like the RTX 2080 Super Founders Edition, it uses a blower style setup with a really awesome looking design. Now I know what you guys are thinking. Usually blower style cards run louder, hotter, and because of that extra heat, typically slower than downdraft designs. Well, as you can see, after 15 minutes of full load in a closed system, both cards run at very similar clock speeds. As a matter of fact, they were nearly identical over the entire test. Moving over to temperatures, the Founders Edition was slightly lower, but that didn't seem to affect performance in any meaningful way. It seems like NVIDIA's boost algorithm is working perfectly well here. With that said, the RTX 2080 Super in this system was a bit louder than the Founders Edition, but it also gave lower interior case temperatures. So there's a bit of trade-off, but not as much as I thought they would be. A lot of this card's ability to properly cool the GPU without getting overly loud comes from its massive copper heatsink and a vapor chamber design. You should also know that the board's design is the same one used on the Founders Edition with an 8+2 phase VRM layout. Alright, with that uninstalled, there's two really interesting things we noticed. The first is the brilliant way OMEN is handling the Wi-Fi on the system. A lot of the motherboards use these antennas that are used to isolate the wireless signal from interference, but they are a royal pain in the butt to find a place for. Here, the antenna arrays start at the M.2 Wi-Fi module and they run behind the motherboard tray and then split and ends on either side of the front panel's OMEN logo. While most of the antenna is behind metal, which would technically reduce EMI and signal strength, the last 3 inches are broadcasting through that clear tempered glass panel. I love it. The other cool little addition is the secondary SATA-powered controller board, which houses all of the necessary functions for RGB lighting in OMEN's control center. That means you can install a different motherboard, hook up to this board, and then still use the built-in app. The control center is actually one of the cleanest and most straightforward pieces of software I've ever seen in a while. Here you can control fan speeds, different RGB zones, and a whole lot more, so having the option to use it with a new motherboard is pretty nice. The next stop on our little tour is the Ryzen 9 3900 processor, which is the real star of the show, since you can't actually go out and buy this thing. And no, it's distributed directly to AMD's system partners, so they can incorporate a high-end processor without worrying about excess heat and power consumption. AMD's engineered the 3900 in a pretty straightforward way. It's a lower power 65-watt version of the 3900X, which features the same 12 cores, 24 thread layout, but it runs at lower clock speeds to keep the TDP in check. But what are you giving up over the 3900X? Well, it turns out not that much. I mean, sure, the 65-watt chip performs a bit slower, but there's still 24 threads chewing away, and that means super fast runs through productivity apps. Even in gaming, the 2080 Super's performance nullifies much of the 3900X's advantage. So basically, getting 90% of the performance from a processor that's got a 40-watt lower TDP. Now, if you want to see a full review of the Ryzen 9 3900, definitely let us know in the comments down below. Now, that lower wattage processor allowed OMEN to use a pretty basic B450 MATX motherboard for the 30L. It actually has one of the first true matte black PCBs I've ever seen, and I think it looks great. There's a single PCIe X16 slot without any other add-in card options, space for 2 memory modules, and the one M.2 slot that allows for full-length SSDs. The other M.2 slot is populated with the Wi-Fi module, and it uses key E, so forget about replacing it with an SSD. It's a bit too bad OMEN didn't use all the space between the CPU cooler and the primary GPU slot for another M.2 drive though. While 3 of the fan headers are used, the one reserved for a liquid cooling pump can have another fan installed. Around the back, there's a standard I/O layout on the USB front, but this board is missing the necessary audio outputs for multi-channel speaker setups. Meanwhile, the 4-pin CPU power connector a 4-layer PCB and limited chipset cooling means there's no official support for overclocking. But Ryzen Master can actually be used to increase clock speeds, but I wouldn't suggest doing that since the CPU cooler and other components aren't built to handle higher power. Plus, you'll void the warranty. Now, under a full system load for about 30 minutes, the VRMs on the board stayed relatively cool, even though there aren't any heatsinks installed. This is probably because part of the cooler's airflow goes directly over them on its way to the exhaust fan. Speaking of the air cooler, it's also designed by Cooler Master and mounted to the motherboard's backplate with 4 Torx bolts. It's topped with a clear RGB LED fan, but the heatsink portion looks a lot like a slightly better version of AMD's Wraith Stealth Cooler. You can really tell that this is made to cool off a 65-watt processor and nothing more, especially since the base doesn't make full contact with the Ryzen CPU's IHS. But does it work well enough? At normal fan speed setting in OMEN's command center, the temperature never got above 84 degrees Celsius and clock speed stayed pretty stable within AMD specs too. And let's be clear, you'd get much lower temperatures and noise by switching this thing out for something like a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black Edition. As for memory, OMEN's using HyperX Fury RGB 3200 MHz CL16 kit, and these seem to be the only ones whose RGB lighting can be controlled through the built-in app. Meanwhile, other modules I have which aren't OMEN certified defaulted to 2400 MHz, and there's no way to manually set speeds in Ryzen Master, the BIOS, or any other piece of software. So it looks like OMEN has optimized their systems for their own validated memory modules. I mean, I hope that this changes in the future because it does limit memory upgrades. The 500-watt 80+ silver rated power supply also comes from Cooler Master. And there's a few unique things about this too. It has flat black cables that blend in perfectly with the 30L's interior design, and unlike a lot of other DIY PSUs, it uses a single rear-mounted exhaust fan instead of a large 120mm or 140mm intake. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually have an on-off switch, so if you'll need to unplug it, if a power cycle is in need, or the system needs to be completely turned off during extended periods of time, you're out of luck. Now, just so you guys know, we did put back the system together after the teardown process, and as you can see, it works. I mean, isn't it amazing to see systems work? They should. You see, while we don't cover a lot of pre-built desktop systems on the channel, taking apart the OMEN 30L showed how much these systems are evolving to offer more of what gamers are looking in a plug-and-play form factor. I mean, let's get real for a sec. For enthusiasts like you and me, these things will never replace the joy of building your own PC. I mean, it's obvious that OMEN did take some inspirations from the DIY market by implementing better components and also offering users easier upgrade options as well. Not to mention, the design is definitely different from pre-built desktop systems from generations ago, and I hope that that trend continues. The 30L isn't necessarily perfect, but I'm excited to see what the next generation of AMD-based gaming PCs are going to look like because the new Ryzen CPUs are right around the corner, so that's exciting as well. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any new content. I'm signing off, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.